So we should, both you and I, we should approach these teachings, approach the Dharma with a very particular frame of mind, a particular attitude. And that is, in this case, the attitude of bodhicitta, the mind of bodhicitta, which is twofold. One aspect of bodhicitta is to maintain an awareness of the due to the unsatisfactory nature of conditioned existence. And as long as beings, we sentient beings, are conditioned, then the natural experience of that conditioning is one of suffering of various forms. Both the suffering that comes from the loss of happiness, the suffering of pain, and the imminent suffering that always is sort of lurking behind our experience, waiting for conditions to come together for it to be felt, to be experienced. And as long as we are, say from the Mahayana point of view, as long as we are acting out of attachment to self, clinging to the feeling of a self, as long as that is occurring, then that conditioning experience will continue. And when through the discovery of wisdom that self-clinging is eliminated, then that's what enlightenment is. And then that is the goal, is that ignorance of self-clinging. And so on the one hand, that circumstance that all living things are involved with should elicit a feeling of compassion and warmth towards all beings. And that compassion should develop into the sincere and insistent aspiration to free beings from conditioning, to free beings from suffering and its source. On the other hand, then, as all living beings have this enlightened potential, that the essence or the essence of the mind of all beings is well, Buddhists use the term Buddha nature. The essence of the mind of all living things is a state of enlightenment, is perfection. Then that wisdom and compassion that's inherent to that nature is directed towards discovering it. So on the one hand, we have compassion for sentient beings. On the other hand, we have this, we direct our wisdom, our knowing mind, we direct towards discovering enlightenment or discovering our perfect wisdom nature. And when those two feelings are present, then that is what's called the presence of bodhicitta. And so in listening to the teachings, especially the teachings that we're discussing, which is the path of bringing bodhicitta to birth, giving rise to bodhicitta, and how to conduct oneself to bringing it to perfection, then that we should always first appreciate and get used to the feeling that bodhicitta is present, and then have the mindfulness and introspection to notice when it's absent, and then have the familiarity with it to be able to restore it, to revive it, and bring it forth again. So here, bodhicitta is the motivation that will interdependently become enriched by hearing the teachings. So then take a moment to give rise to that twofold intention, and then try to maintain it. Of course, the whole theme of Shantideva's work here is the 10 chapters can be divided up into how to give rise to bodhicitta when it's not there, and that's what is covered in the first 3 chapters. And then, of course, Shantideva also is aware that just because bodhicitta has been brought forth intentionally, that because we're not used to it, it's not strong, it's forgettable. Even you, maybe in the morning when we wake up and pull ourselves together, we take refuge and generate this, take again the vow to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, and committing ourselves to engaging in the bodhisattva conduct. And we can say the words that correspond with that vow, but it's not too long before where that intention is lost, and basically we just come back to our own self-interest. Like we need to eat, or we need to go to the bathroom, or we need to get dressed or leave the house, and we contract. And there's no reason why we can't maintain that, even though maintain that bodhicitta uninterruptedly while we go through the motions of our everyday life. Those bodhicitta and living, with all it entails, are not in, they don't contradict one another. So in the 4th, 5th, and 6th chapters, the next 3 chapters, Shantideva outlines for us how to not let that bodhicitta become forgotten, or how not to lose bodhicitta. And then in those chapters, the why bodhicitta becomes lost or corrupted is very clearly and elaborately stated again and again. And why we lose bodhicitta is through the force of our habitual habit of being overpowered by our mental afflictions, desire, anger, jealousy, pride, fear, doubt, envy, greed, and so on and so forth. There's those principal sorts of afflictions, and then of course there's many sort of everyday or pedestrian forms of those afflictions. Annoyance, cravings, and so forth. Those are, and Shantideva in the text and in those these 3 chapters, and those become the target of our practice. In order to sustain and become more and more familiar with, more and more used to bodhicitta. And so we're on the 6th chapter, which is exclusively exclusively dedicated to patience, which means the absence of anger. So anger, as one of the mental afflictions, is one of the it's one of the most it's the cause. Anger is the cause of our most difficult experiences. Our unbearable experiences are caused by anger. and our potential to experience the results of anger are always in Buddhist texts very graphically conveyed, just to show just how damaging to our spirit, to our mind, anger is. And as we've already discussed, where are we? In the first verses, then Shantideva, as is typical in teachings of this nature, first you should, through your ability to analyze, understand what the disadvantages of not being patient are, and which he talks about here, and this is important, and it's how the teachings are conveyed. These kinds of teachings that involve conduct are conveyed, like generosity and discipline, and now patience, and diligence, and meditative stability, and wisdom, and so forth. Like, it's important for us to be exposed to and to contemplate, reflect often and many times, and as deeply as we can, on what are the disadvantages of not being, say, generous, not being disciplined, not being, say, patient in this case, and not being diligent, and not being mental, not having mental meditative stability. What are the disadvantages of that? And what are the advantages? What benefit is it to be generous? What's the benefit of moral making? What do you say? Positive, wholesome, moral lifestyle choices, basically. And what are the advantages of being patient compared to the disadvantages of not being patient? It's important for us to measure these two aspects. It's like in the very first chapter, all the topic of the first chapter was all about the advantages of bodhicitta. And that can lift our spirits, and that can inspire us to practice. And when we receive teachings on different meditation techniques or different topics regarding the path, often we hear all the good things that will arise from our practice, and that inspires us to begin the practice. But as it turns out, that inspiration to practice will, because of impermanence and because of perhaps the newness, the unfamiliarity we are with any sort of Dharma practice, that unfamiliarity with it, that will diminish, that inspiration will not support that practice for very long. And then if we have also considered the disadvantages of not practicing generosity, not practicing patience and so forth, that's when that familiarity with the disadvantages will kick in and support the practice. Sometimes we do things because we want to do them, and sometimes we do things because we don't want to not do, because of what will happen if we don't do them. And that's one of the, I think that's one of the, when we talk about this precious human life, the ability to do that, the ability to discern and analyze and reflect on advantages and disadvantages of our actions, our speech, our behavior, our mental, our thoughts and so forth, and how we relate to our emotions. Being able to see, reflect on the advantages and disadvantages is a quality that this precious human life, precious human birth has. And that's that kind of an individual who has that ability, that's one of the factors of a precious human birth. It's not necessarily a human skill. All human beings don't have a precious human birth. What in our terminology we term it a precious human birth. And so we, as we go through this text and attempt to see what the intention of it is, and to reflect on how to put these verses into practice, why we can do that is because we have this precious human birth. And so it's important to, on a regular basis, to reflect back into ourselves on, like if we have done some kind of self-counseling or some kind of meditation practice or some kind of development of bodhicitta, it's important to, every once in a while, to reflect back on how is it that I was able to practice that, and what was the cause, what actions did my mind engage in that enables me to be able to see the difference between virtue and non-virtue, for instance. And we can see also, if we're talking about the disadvantages of anger, as Shantideva talks about in the first, 7 or 8 verses here, 10 verses. If we, anyway, that's an important piece in our practice, is both the advantages of doing it and the disadvantages of not doing it. Those two habits, those two, becoming familiar with those two aspects of the content of our practice will support our practice in all the way, in all our moods, basically, all of our moods. So, okay, so then another aspect that is a general thing to know about when it comes to practicing the Dharma is, what's the target? And for instance, in the carefulness chapter, basically we're learning about the target of our concern, which is the mental afflictions. just like in Buddhist practice and Dharma practice, the target, in general, the target is enlightenment. And it's not, although we haven't experienced it yet, and we can't ourselves say, oh, enlightenment means this, that, and the other thing, but it's not a mystery. You know, that's what a huge part of the compendium of Buddhist scriptures, of the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni, and then subsequent those who have brought those teachings to perfection, and enlightenment is quite widely discussed and well known. We need to know what the target is. It's not just shooting an arrow into space. It's like when we say bodhicitta, like in the first chapter, the first 3 chapters really discuss what bodhicitta is. And so we should be aware that bodhicitta isn't just it means something. And if it's going to be our goal and the core of our practice, then we should understand what it means, both just from a very ordinary point of view, a very like what does the words mean, and what is the goal, what's the feeling of it, what's the duration of it, and so forth. So it's always good to know what our target is. Buddhist practice for a Dharma practitioner, we should be aware that just being vague about things is not really productive. Even we have some vague understanding of even, say, emptiness. Like, of course, we may have that, but we shouldn't cling to that as any sort of accomplishment. So in the 11th verse here, Shantideva pinpoints down on the target of our practice, which is like what are the occurrences, or how do I say that? When what occurs do we practice? When do we practice patience, I guess? When do we practice patience? And so then he talks about these, of course he pinpoints things, and of course those are always having various levels of understanding them, but here pain, humiliation, insults, or rebukes. And so we can take those 4 points and kind of expand them into our own direct experience. Pain or suffering, humiliation or being discriminated against, or being considered to, being sort of out, what do you say? Being being the object of contempt, and then insults are more of a verbal aggression, verbal abuse, and then rebukes. I don't know rebukes exactly, but this has something to do with our how we are known, our reputation, or our, say, when our reliability is undermined through others, or if we have a good reputation, it's undermined unjustly or whatever. We're just talking about just that. These are points of calling forth patience when these things occur, and when they occur to us. And then, as he talks about here, either for ourselves or those we love, which has to do with our group, people who think like us, people who look like us, people who act like us, our pets, people who don't like our pets, we feel, so our those we love, doesn't have to be love, but could be family, friends, but also just our club, our politics, our social standing. We all have this sort of our karmic group, collective karma group. So we may not be suffering or discriminated or insulted or abused or the object of bad rumors and bad reputation, but someone else that we relate with may, and we get angry. So those also is an object, those are also occurrences of when we should apply patience, develop patience. And so then there's 4, and then there's 8. Then there's the past resentments that we have, objects of patience that we need to apply for these occurrences that happen in the past. Our past, our family's past, our friends' past, our groups, our clubs' past, in the past that we still carry. And when those conditions come together and we experience that, then that's when we should recognize, oh, this is the object of patience. And also in the future, the past, present, and future, these occurrences. And then there's the opposite, like when the other group is happy, we need to be practicing patience. When the other group, our enemy, is successful, they win and they're successful, then we need to practice patience. When they're praised, when our enemies are praised, we need to practice patience. When they have a good reputation, they've been, what do you say? Their case was dismissed in court, and then we need to practice patience when their good reputation is acknowledged, this kind of thing. So basically, the opposite of what we want for ourselves and our group is what how we think our enemies, let's say, enemies. And the past, present, and future of our enemies, our impatience, our anger, or our discomfort with the success and happiness of our enemies from the past, present, and future also. So there's these, basically it comes to 72 different targets for or like little light bulbs, or like little, what do you call it, little reminders. Bing, when we recollect or think up something about that makes us angry, that makes us first we just get annoyed, and then we get angry or irritated, angry, and so forth. And we're the only ones that it harms. And so, like I was saying last time, the real deep practice of patience has to begin with getting over not wanting to suffer, getting over not wanting to be humiliated, getting over not wanting to be insulted, not wanting to be rebuked or had bad rumors about you. We have to get over our association with that being unwanted. That if when something unwanted lands in our lap and we don't react traditionally like we always have by not wanting it and just let it be there, that wedge between something unwanted and our Dharma practice there'll be an opening made that will allow that Dharma practice to become deeper. If we're always fighting off, if we're always considering suffering to be unwanted, then how are we ever going to practice patience? You might ask yourself that. We need to have these things occur in order to practice patience. How could you practice patience if there's no object to practice patience with? So we need to recognize that we need to let down our territoriality or our what do you call those? We live in we need to let our wall down and participate in the world free of fear of suffering, not being afraid to suffer. We have the capacity to transform circumstances into the path. They won't transform themselves into the path if we don't want them to occur. We have basic teachings on impermanence, on karma, the unsatisfactory nature of samsara, of conditioning. So how can we deepen those contemplations? Is by accepting suffering, accepting unwanted circumstances when they, as I say, land in our lap. And if we accept them and kind of almost hold them in a very, almost like you hold a baby or a baby bird, not a baby bird, any bird, if you hold a bird, you don't want it to get away, but you're not holding tight, just enough like that. That's how we should accept and hold our pain, our suffering, our rebukes, our humiliation, these kind of things. We should hold them that way. Then we can apply. Then we can apply the Dharma to that. There's a field of operation that can occur if we just hold our pain in that way. We can apply our understanding of karma, and well, nothing occurs without a cause. And we can deepen our understanding of that by accepting that, well, this has caused me to suffer. So since suffering is the result of negative actions, negative karma, physical, verbal, or mental, then the fact that I'm suffering because of this thing that landing in my lap, the fact that I'm suffering means that there is a cause. And the cause has to do with my mind's endless, beginningless history of acting out of self-interest and delusion. And this is the result of this is the result of some negative action. Everything that occurs only occurs through causes and conditions. And the conditions arise through our relationships and through our life, and the causes are our past actions. And so if we can bring that contemplation forth in the space within a difficult circumstance like that, then our understanding of karma will deepen. And our understanding of or we could say, oh, I was happy a minute ago, and somebody just said something to me that caused my heart to break, and I feel crushed, and so, well, that's impermanence. If you're holding it and if you're not trying to get rid of it, then you can deepen your understanding of impermanence. Wow, I was so happy a few seconds ago. Wow, that happiness, I really clung to that happiness. I didn't understand that happiness is impermanent. And now this suffering is coming. So that's how I'm experiencing impermanence. And even this suffering is impermanent. It wasn't, it is, and it won't be. So then you become less suffering. Many things like this. Refuge. Oh, I guess I'm not enlightened. That really upset me. I thought I was much more beyond being disturbed. You know, I really need to take refuge. You know? Even if you're very good at this kind of applying the Dharma to a circumstance, you can develop compassion. I'm not alone with this suffering. You know, many people, many beings, maybe all beings, also have to experience this. How sad for all beings. What can I do to relieve the suffering of all beings? I must attain enlightenment. I must develop a good, kind relationship with others. Like this kind of practice. This is practicing with the world, in the world. We need that. It's not that we should think of the Dharma and try to get rid of our experiences, like using the Dharma like to throw stones at suffering, but to practice with suffering to deepen our understanding of the Dharma, to deepen it and broaden it. The Dharma is deep and the Dharma is vast. And we have a little, you know, where our toes are in the water and the waves kind of flop in and out and we get wet sometimes and then it goes away. So we need to deepen our understanding of, in this case, patience and broaden it. Okay, so that's that idea. Then, okay, so moving on to where we left off. So all of these topics up in the next, up to verse 21, where he says here, suffering has its worth. That's what we're trying to come to. Suffering has a use. Through sorrow, pride is driven out, and pity felt for those who wander in samsara. Evil's avoided. We say, oh, this is suffering. I'm feeling suffering. It had a negative cause. I need to become more scrupulous in my speech, in my negative mind. I need to reduce my negative actions because nobody wants to suffer. Okay, so that idea was discussed, what to do with suffering. Also, the same logic applies for the other four unwanted circumstances here, or the other objects of patience, being discriminated against, being abused verbally or aggressively, or being, having your reputation, what is it? Besmirched? Is that smirched or besmirched? Besmirched? Yeah, that. Suddenly you hear rumors, or your Facebook thing, or your other thing, whatever those things are. You're being trashed for no reason at all, for something you didn't even say or do or anything. But so then that's when we should practice patience. Okay. So now in verse 22, this gets this interesting part. Now this has to do with, in the outline, it has to do with, basically this has to do with applying the kind of the absolute truth. Well, I didn't bring the outline. This has to do with gaining certainty in the gaining certainty regarding the ultimate nature of things. This has to do with kind of the absolute aspect. Again, I think, like when I look into these things, I said, gosh, you really need a precious human birth. You need to have this cognitive capacity for these kinds of topics. Other being, like most people, maybe, I'm not being like elitist, I don't think, or anything, but, animals, they do great, amazing things, but they can't do this. They can't think this way. Okay, so we might be able to put up with injury, our own injuries, but we still have issues with the source of those things, the person who causes suffering. Okay, I'm suffering and I'm dealing with it, but I still hate you. My anger is directed towards an individual. So then Shantideva says, I'm not angry with my bile and other humors, fertile source of suffering and pain. Okay, of course, this is reflecting the medical theories during this 7th century, which are also still around. Indian Ayurveda ideas of the bile, the phlegm, and the wind as being the three sort of factors that that are always seeking kind of the homeostasis. And we also can apply the same to however we conceive of our body. But when we have a disease, an illness, what he's saying is here, we don't get angry at the illness, which is the source of our suffering. Illness is what occurs when certain circumstances occur. Coincident, they come together, having to do with food, personal lifestyle, lifestyle things, smoking, lazy, lifestyle things. And then time, condition, change of temperature, change of seasons, and humidity, and barometric pressure, and all these other things that have to do with the condition of time conditions, and also what are called like bad influences, I guess, like COVID-19, like that, some kind of influence. But that's all, that illness only arose through circumstances. Various circumstances came together. We ate something, and then we got a cramp, and then we got cold and sweaty, and then we wanted to throw up, and then we got diarrhea, and all these things all came together, and we have an illness. That illness didn't intentionally arise. It didn't have its own autonomy. It was just it's just what occurred, what was experienced when various factors came together. Maybe something landed, a fly landed on the food, or wasn't cooked right, or left out too long, and then we ate it. Then why? Then the fly was where? Someplace else. And then, everything, there was no autonomous, independent factor that created the autonomous illness. There's no such thing. Everything came together. Everything is just the coming together of circumstances. Everything is circumstantial. And so Shantideva here is comparing that to enemies. And likewise, though unwanted and unsought, defilements nonetheless insistently arise through causes and conditions. So both diseases, illness, and enemies they're not independent agents of suffering. They only arise through causes and conditions. That illness didn't intentionally occur for you. Just like, and he's coming right out, he's saying that same with the enemies. There was no real enemy. Everything was circumstantial. And we know, as he mentioned earlier, one of the conditions for anger is a mind, an unhappy state of mind. That's sort of our contribution to the circumstances, to the collection of circumstances that produce something unwanted. That those things themselves have no independent existence. Never thinking, now I will be angry, just like a disease, like I don't know about COVID-19 enough, but like food poisoning or whatever you call it. It didn't exist Like food poisoning as an illness didn't exist independently and come into you. It didn't want to come into you. It didn't have the energy or the power to come into you. A stomach ache. It's all through the interdependent, the circumstances come together. Similarly, then, people also are impulsively caught up in anger. And irritation likewise comes, though never plans to be experienced. Our anger doesn't plan, it doesn't have agency. It's not self-powered. It only arises through circumstances. He's going into that here, but that's the idea. Just like like a reflection in a mirror. A mirror doesn't intend to reflect an object. An object doesn't intend to be reflected. It doesn't intend to produce a reflection. It just comes together through circumstances. Infallibly. You can never have a mirror with an object in front of it when it doesn't reflect it. I heard that vampire people, or those kind of people, they don't have a corporeal body. It doesn't count. But that idea, an object will always be reflected in a mirror, and neither party has any control over that. Just like an enemy and a disease, they are not they're not intentional. All defilements of whatever kind, defilements here meaning like afflictions, we've been saying afflictions, the kleshas, the whole variety of evil deeds, killing, stealing, greed, all that, are brought about by circumstances. None is independent, none autonomous. The kleshas, hatred, they don't actually exist as something. It's all comes about by an aggregation of circumstances. I think Shantideva made quick mention of this earlier in the 4th chapter about the kleshas and how they're just like an illusion. So here he's saying here, none of these things are independent, none are autonomous. They have no power to act on their own in the absence of circumstances. It's only through the coming together of circumstances that we can say that there is anger. But anger doesn't have its own existence. So then contemplate that, reflect on that again and again and again, and uproot. That will uproot your reaction to suffering with anger. It will uproot that hatred. And there's no reason for it. It's unreasonable. And that, again, that space that wisdom, that reflection evokes is what you feel, that's how you feel compassion. You develop compassion, not hatred, not anger, but compassion. And in order to do that, we just can't force it. There has to be a underlying, here we're talking about analyzing and reflecting and going through there's an underlying logic that leads to truth. Truth. Again, here this section of this from chapter verse 22 on here for these verses here. It's about the truth. Apply the truth to unwanted circumstances. Whether they go away or not is secondary. Your truth will deepen. Your understanding of the truth will deepen. And I hope that people that are interested in Dharma, like studying Dharma or contemplating Dharma or applying and practicing Dharma, I hope that we can always feel as though all we want is the truth. We don't want to just become a perfect model Dharma person so much. We want to know the truth. What's the truth? So here, because we're so irritable and we're so easily provoked by these different factors, humiliation and so forth, our lives are very fertile for discovering the truth. And that's what Shantideva is exposing us to here as a topic to be reflected on, not just a philosophy. Oh, I believe that this about, a lack of autonomy, I believe that and everything. Well, that may, that's a start. Of course, we have to take that as a start, but that's not going to hold water if the next time somebody comes up and just slaps you in the face for no reason. Okay, 26. Conditions once assembled have no thought that they will now give rise to some result. So, okay, we have the conditions. We have the, for instance, we have our sense perceptions rely on an organ like an eyeball or eye, and then an object. And when an object appears before an eye, just like a reflection in a mirror, then the connection between the object and the eye consciousness arises. The eye consciousness depends on the coming together of an object and an organ of perception. Or if it's a sound, then it's the auditory, and the sound gives rise to the sound consciousness, hearing consciousness, and so forth. So those things, our eye and the object and our eye consciousness, and our eye consciousness, there's and it goes on from there, but the coincidence of these here three factors can give rise to the mental experience of anger. Your object is what you don't want to see, or the ear thing is what you don't want to hear, and then so forth. But none of those factors intended to produce anger. Anger arose in dependence on the circumstance, the conditions that came together. But those conditions didn't think up to become angry. Of course, we can also assert that by saying that somebody that you think is beautiful, if they actually were truly beautiful, then everyone that saw them would have the same, would think of them as being beautiful. So we can kind of prove that as part of our, that's our own perception. If there's no object of sight, then there's no seeing that occurs with the eye or the eye consciousness, and then there's no action directed towards that object. So none of those factors had the thought that they were going to give rise to some result. And nor does that which is engendered think that it has been produced. So anger doesn't regard itself as something that's been produced by those conditions. There's no trace of independent, autonomous anger, or there's no agent of anger. Okay. Then Shantideva is, I'll just go over these things quickly because it has to do with it's not non-Buddhist actually, because there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of our personality and our makeup that hasn't yet become Buddhist. It's almost like molecule by molecule. We are converting ourselves to the truth of the Dharma. So we can't say that like well, some of them are still persistent now, but and certainly we, even though from when we hear in Buddhism how Buddhism, logically and through direct experience and through the teachings of Buddha, there is no permanent self. Now we have the feeling that there's this continual self, there's this continual agent that's walking and sitting and talking. There's always seems like there's somebody in there that has that's persistently there. And that habit is called self-clinging. And the only way that we can really, the only evidence of self-clinging that we can experience is in our kleshas, the mental afflictions. Those are kind of the exhaust. It's like the exhaust of an invisible car. I think in the sutras it talks about the kleshas are the footprint of self-clinging. So these schools, so we have this belief. So we do believe in permanence, because when we, when we through interdependence, when something occurs, we can very easily freeze it. We solidify it, and it becomes a memory. There's a memory, but it also becomes an entity. It becomes it becomes an object, and it becomes also a reference point for other similar but distinct objects. And that fixation or that solidification occurs because we have fixated on the existence of a self when there is none. And that relationship we have with the those that we don't consider the self become a projection of that. So that's why it's important for us to meditate again and again and again, thoroughly, up, down, every which way, on impermanence. Because we have the habit of, we may not call it that, especially good Buddhists don't talk about, believing in things as being permanent. But we suffer when things express impermanence because we did attach permanence to it. We do believe in permanence because we believe in a self. And as long as we have the belief in an abiding permanent self, that will be projected into our perception, our world, as also equally real, true, and abiding, and reliable. And that is the fundamental problem of why we are suffering. It's a mistake. So these non-Buddhists, Shantideva here is kind of refuting or attacking or refuting those what do you call it? Those existing schools of thought that he was around in India, and they're, like I say, they're not like they're people. There are groups who believe in the true existence of a self, and that there's also groups that believe in the true existence of, like this Purusha and what is it called, Purusha and Pramrita. I used to know these things. Now I can't remember all this this kind of thing. But anyway, there's Indian. I didn't want to get into that here, but there's those who believe in the mind as being unconscious and subject to outer things, but it's permanent. And basically, Shantideva is saying here that if mind was permanent, if self was permanent, then there'd be no such thing as anger. Nothing could affect it, because what's permanent is not subject to impermanence, nor is it subject to birth and death. If something's permanent means permanent, unchanging. And so this self can't be considered to be valid because it becomes angry, for instance, and things like that. Anyway, he's saying the primal substance, which is this Purusha, as they say, and that which has been called the self, this Atman, do not arise designedly, and do not think I will become. So this self doesn't come from some pre-existing state. If something can come into being, then it's impermanent and dependent, and it's not permanent. It has no autonomy. And then if they, for that which is not born does not exist, so what could want to come to be? So something can't want to arise as something that can be declared to be permanent. And permanently drawn towards its object, it can never cease from being so. So there's also this idea that there's a permanent perceiver that relates to objects. And if that was so, then it would never react, it would never change, it would be permanent, and that's not the case. Indeed, this self, if permanent, is certainly inert like space itself. So this one, if we're talking about this kind of unconscious but permanent self that doesn't have its own consciousness, then it would be like space. And should it meet with other factors like anger, how could it affect it since it's unchanging? So it would be, by definition, is beyond causation. If when conditions act on it, on a self, it stays just as it was before, then what influence have these conditions had? They wouldn't have any influence on it. They say these are agents of the self. So these, again, this is some theories of non-Buddhist theories where, well, that there's these things that occur that to the self, but he's saying that but what connection could there possibly be between them? It would just prove the permanence of self if something impermanent had a relationship with something that was permanent. Then it couldn't be permanent. So what's permanent can't be assisted by circumstantial occurrences and conditions. Anyway, this is, I don't understand all of this, but Shantideva, he's trying to refine people who have these notions still within them, and he gets pretty strong-headed, pretty strong about it in the 9th chapter, the wisdom chapter. So consequently, 31, I'm going to move on. 31, consequently, then all things then depend on other things. So harm doers, enemies, aggressors are under the influence of other things. They're not autonomous. And likewise, depend. All things then depend on other things, and these likewise depend. They're not independent. This dependence, everything depends on something else. And so there's this endless regression of foregoing causes. It's ad infinitum. You check it out. You know, this caused that. Okay, what brought that into? Why did that? How is that the cause? And again and again. That's why there's this. The logic here also refers to like our past. You know, that kind of, it's the way that we can appreciate that there were past lives. Otherwise, we'd be stuck with thinking that somehow or other there was a first cause. Well, what caused the first cause? So in Buddhism, the truth of the matter is that those notions of an original cause or even outside influencing, causing things, it doesn't hold water. Everything is empty. Everything depends on something else for its existence. Nothing is independent or autonomous. Knowing this, in other words, knowing how everything is interdependent, we will not be annoyed at things that are like magical appearances. In other words, everything is empty of its own identity, its own agency. but we can't deny that it occurs. If I have this food poisoning and I'm gonna throw up, I'm gonna throw up. So everything appears, but it doesn't appear as anything that truly exists. It only occurred through circumstances, and it never came into its own independent, autonomous being or occurrence. So understanding this, the more we understand this, then the more we won't allow ourselves to become angry at what didn't exist, both the object of our patience, our enemy, and our suffering. Neither one exists in any true sense of the word. And so coming to this understanding of how interdependence means emptiness. Shunyata means interdependence. Interdependence means shunyata. And so the theme of this section here then is how we should come to a greater and greater understanding of the true nature of phenomena, of things. And that will become the ostensibly the antidote to anger. In other words, that will be our patience. Our patience will be our understanding of interdependence. That's what patience is. Then, okay. Then 32, he says, now he's saying like, oh, you might think, well, if everything's an illusion and everything is empty of its own nature, like say, then what's the point of being patient? There's nothing to be patient towards. You know, it says resistance, you may say, is out of place. For what will be opposed by whom? Huh? Makes sense. From the absolute point of view, yes. There is no abuser, there's no abused. From the absolute point of view, and we should understand that. We're invited and led to understand this. But on the other hand, from the conventional point of view, from the point of view of operational, conventional reality, or what could be called from the point of view of a truth that's overlaid and hides the absolute truth, he says here, the stream of sorrow is cut by patience. There is nothing out of place in our assertion. So our patience, if we apply from the relative point of view, patience, that patience can be considered to have been caused by anger. And through anger, our patience becomes developed, and the development of patience is cuts samsara. It cuts pain. Here it says the stream of sorrow. In other words, this endless river of suffering, of samsara, is cut by patience. And patience is caused by anger. And so we deal with things from both a conventional point of view, from the overlay onto this absolute truth, and also from this absolute point of view. And we can approach this absolute point of view here through using our precious human birth and its capacity to analyze based on a teaching, based on a gift of the Dharma. And so we're using both the absolute point of view and the conventional point of view to develop patience. And patience is the practice of the Bodhisattva. And patience, again, here means the absence of anger, which also means the absence of irritation, which causes anger, and the absence of being annoyed, which is the cause of irritation. And we become annoyed because we didn't want to be bothered with something. And we didn't want to become bothered with something. Now you can answer that. You can find out for yourself why you didn't want to be bothered with something, but it had something to do with you weren't thinking about the truth. So even in the sutras, the Mahayana sutras, they use this term patience in a very way to describe different samadhis that the bodhisattvas are abiding in. Like he was patient with the samadhi of this, patient with the samadhi of that. In other words, there was no sense of disturbance or wanting something more. The patience with that. Thus, okay, next verse 33. Thus, okay, this is so therefore, or thus, or then, when enemies or friends are seen to act improperly, meaning harmful, enemies act, are bothering you, and friends are bothering you, remain calm, serene, and call to mind that everything arises from conditions. So call to mind the above explanation, basically, is what the commentary is saying. Like, have that explanation in your mind so that when something arises unwanted like this, something, when you see something that's harmful, then remember that everything arises from circumstance. Everything is circumstantial. Nothing intended to do anything. It all arose like a reflection in a mirror, just through the interdependence of various circumstances. There was no pre-standing, autonomously existing event. Like you could look at a war, a conflict anywhere. We got them all over the place, and try to, and to try to find really where is the war. The war is people fighting. Well, who are those people? And each one of them is fighting why, and what's the cause of that? And all you do is it's this regressing reiteration of causes and effects, causes and conditions. There's never any original cause for a struggle like that. Everything arises from conditions, from other things. And Shantideva will continue with how to kind of diminish the significance of suffering and humiliation and these things as we go along in the rest of the chapter. But the point here is there's good reason to not react with anger to enemies, to harm. There's good logical reasoning. And so explore that reasoning and try it. And remember these teachings is what he's saying here. Okay, so I'll end with that, and we'll pick it up again next week, next time.